Gonzaga will face a Big 12 opponent early in the upcoming season, although it's not exactly the marquee matchup fans were hoping for.
You are Locked On Zags, your daily podcast on the Gonzaga Bulldogs. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What is going on, y'all? Happy Thursday, and welcome into the Locked On Zags podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I'm your host and longtime Gonzaga podcaster, Andy Patton, here to bring you news and updates on all things Zag athletics. Today's episode of Locked On Zags is brought to you by Game Time. Folks, download the Game Time app now, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONCollege for $20 off your first purchase. Terms do apply. Jam-packed show for you today. We're going to discuss Gonzaga's latest scheduling updates. We're going to take a look at the non-conference as a whole, what still might be to come. We got 4 more games left on that non-conference slate, so we're going to talk about how those games might be filled. We're also going to close out the show with a preview of the Team USA versus Serbia game. Winner of that guaranteed to medal in the 2024 Olympic Games. We'll talk about that as well. The lead for today's show, and this did come out, as you're listening to this, probably about a day and a half ago. So we're just getting into it now as we had Theo Lawson on the show yesterday and wanted to talk about the WCC conference schedule, of course, as it so often happens when Gonzaga news happens, it all happens at once. So we got the update on the WCC conference schedule. We got this update about a new game on the schedule. We got another update about another scheduling game as well. But the big news out of all of this, Gonzaga will play Arizona State, Bobby Hurley's club, the Sun Devils, on November 10th, part of a 2-year home-and-home series agreed to between Few and Hurley. November 10th, McCarthy Athletic Center, not guaranteed to be Gonzaga's first game of the season, but potentially Gonzaga's first game of the season. We'll see if they end up playing a game prior to that. Obviously, they'll have exhibition games. Maybe we'll get to see potentially an exciting exhibition game like we've seen in the past when they've scrimmaged against teams like Tennessee or Baylor, or we might just end up seeing a Lewis Clark State or something in that ilk. But if Arizona State's not Gonzaga's first game of the season, it'll almost certainly be their second game of the season, right at the top of that schedule. The return game will be in Tempe next season in the 25-26 campaign. Obviously, no date set for that game yet, but a true home-and-home series. No neutral sites here. These games are going to be played at the home arenas between these two teams. This feels like kind of a response to Gonzaga losing the Washington series. Obviously, that was a series that was expected to be extended all the way through the 26th season. So these next 2 years, there was a clause in that contract that those two schools had with each other that a coaching change could allow either program to just remove themselves from the series. Washington heading into the Big Ten with an expanded conference slate and a new head coach in Danny Sprinkle coming over from Utah State opted not to play the game this year. You can think about that what you will. I know some of the belief of why Washington might cancel that game, as obviously Washington will also counter by pointing out that they won the game last year, which is very true. But ultimately, this probably does come down to just managing a non-conference schedule that is significantly smaller for Washington now that they head into the Big Ten, which is not good. It's not good for Gonzaga. It's not good for mid-major schools in general that this is happening. But we were never seriously concerned that Mark Few and the Zags wouldn't be able to find at least some kind of caliber game. And if you're a longtime listener to the show, you know that I've kind of broken up Gonzaga's non-conference schedule into the 3 different categories: the bye games, which are when they bring in, the SWAC teams, the Texas Southerns, the Tarleton States, the Cal Baptists, whomever. Then there's the marquee games. That's your Kentucky, UConn, UCLA, San Diego State, whomever. And then they kind of have those mid-level games. And we've kind of seen those mid-level games shrink a little bit. That Gonzaga, and that part of that is just having less non-conference games coming into this season. And part of that is just having, again, you kind of have to manage those games. And you need the bye games. You want the bye games for tune-ups. You're paying these teams to come to your campus and lose effectively. They're home games. They're for the fans. They're an opportunity to kind of experiment with new lineups, things like that. They also pad your resume, pad the net rankings and all that good stuff. And then you have your marquee games. Those are the ones, the powerhouse ones. And the mid ones just aren't as impactful. Gonzaga Washington was important because Washington was a rival and you wanted that game for that kind of regional rivalry aspect of it. But if Washington doesn't want to play the game, Gonzaga's got to look elsewhere. And they've kind of filled this mid-level game in the past with teams like Yale, who upset Auburn in the NCAA tournament last year, or Kent State a couple years ago, who's a very, very good team who I think ended up getting a 12 seed in the NCAA tournament that year. So Arizona State kind of feels like they're in that ilk a little bit. They're one of 4 new teams joining the Big 12 this year, of course, alongside Arizona, Colorado, and Utah, the 4 corner schools from the former Pac-12 going into that conference. And one thing that really stood out to me when looking at this and doing some research on it, these 2 teams have never played each other. And I find that very surprising. That really, I was not expecting that at all. We know that even Gonzaga's history against other Pac-12 schools, a lot of them date back a long, long time. Gonzaga hasn't played quite a few Pac-12 schools, even in the Mark Few era. Like they haven't played Oregon State in like 50-something years, and of course they will this year. They don't play Oregon very often. Obviously, Washington and Washington State were the 2 that they played more regularly, in Arizona and UCLA. But a lot of these teams don't line up with Gonzaga very often. But I was still surprised that Arizona State, who has a relatively rich basketball history, it's not great. It's certainly not comparable to Arizona's, but they've had success. They've had good teams. And yet these 2 teams have never actually managed to match up. Getting to know this program a little bit more, and we'll, of course, do a bigger preview of this actual game when we get closer to the date. Hopefully we can get Richie Bradshaw, the host of the Locked On Sun Devils podcast, on the show to talk a little bit about this team. But they're entering their 10th season under Coach Bobby Hurley. Of course, Bobby Hurley, the brother of Dan Hurley, the more successful brother in terms of playing career, but the less successful brother in terms of a coaching career. Mark Few apparently was like, you know what? I'm tired of losing to Danny Hurley, so I'm going to go get Bobby Hurley on the calendar, maybe an easier victory for the Zags. Don't want to say it's a guaranteed win, but it's going to be a heck of a lot easier to beat Arizona State at home than it is to beat UConn at the Madison Square Garden, which is where they get them this year. Hurley has been to 3 NCAA tournaments in his 10 years with Arizona State, but has been a play-in 11 seed all 3 times. 2 of those 3 times they won the play-in game and then lost in the first round to a 6 seed. The other time they lost the play-in game. So you count play-in games as NCAA tournament victories. So technically Bobby Hurley has 2 NCAA tournament wins, but really he has not advanced outside of the first round. He has not even advanced to the round of 32 in a 10-year run at Arizona State. There's not a lot of high expectations for Arizona State basketball. They're not pouring in a bunch of money, although it does sound like that NIL has improved for Arizona State very recently, and I think that might help Bobby Hurley in terms of getting more marquee talent into the program, although it also puts a little bit more pressure on him to actually win basketball games. And folks, it's going to be a heck of a lot harder to win basketball games in the Big 12 than it was in the Pac-12, and he wasn't very good at that either last year. 8-12 in the Pac-12, 14-18 overall. They lost a road game at San Diego, which was one of the more baffling results of the season last year, at least in terms of WCC play. First of all, I don't know why Arizona State agreed to go to the Jenny Craig Pavilion and play San Diego in a true road game. They did it. They lost. Kind of a strange result there. They finished 127th in the country using Bart Torvik's rankings. Preseason has them ranked 67th. And part of that, they lost a ton of talent. Most of their high-level scorers from last year's team is gone. Frankie Collins hit the transfer portal. Jose Perez is out of eligibility. They lost a lot of the other kind of key pieces for that team, but they brought in quite a bit of talent. And I think that's why there are some higher expectations. And again, potentially more pressure on Bobby to get it done and get into the big dance, get a higher than an 11 seeder, at the very least, advance to the round of 32, maybe even the Sweet 16. They add a really high-profile freshman in Jaden Quintance, 6'9" big man, top 10 in the 2024 recruiting class. He's really young, so young, in fact, that he has to be in college for 2 years. He's not eligible for the NBA draft after his freshman season. He was a Kentucky commit who decommitted after Calipari left for Arkansas. Arizona State swooped in. This is why a lot of people think that NIL must be doing all right for the Sun Devils, because they managed to land a really high-profile player, very young, very raw. He's going to have a very good early season test against Graham Ike and Braden Huff and Ben Gregg for this Gonzaga roster. The upside for him is extremely high, but Gonzaga getting him in one of, if not his very first game, is probably an advantage for Gonzaga and a bit of a welcome to college basketball moment for this young kid. They get BJ Freeman, transfer out of Milwaukee, Alston Mason, a transfer from Missouri State. Adam Miller is back. He averaged about 12-3 last year. So they got some talent on this roster. It's going to be a fun game. It's going to be a decent game. Gonzaga is going to be favored, and they should win this one, especially at home. But it's a good home game for Gonzaga. Not great. It's not Texas coming into the building or North Carolina, but it is a good quality power level team that is now in the Big 12. I'm glad that they got this deal done. Again, I think it replaces the Washington game. We're going to talk more about the rest of the non-conference schedule, what other games might be showing up, but this may be the last big marquee game. I'm hoping there's at least one more good game added to Gonzaga's schedule. And I know people were excited about some of the other opportunities that were out there and may not feel great about Arizona State being perhaps the last marquee or pseudo marquee game added to the calendar. But I think this is a fun and good quality kind of mid-level matchup for Gonzaga in the non-conference slate this upcoming season. Well, folks, let's look at the rest of that non-conference schedule. Not only do we know many of the matchups, 27 of Gonzaga's 31 games are currently accounted for. We now have a date for Gonzaga's matchup against San Diego State. We're going to talk about that coming up in just a second. But first, folks, let's talk about game time. Minor league baseball season is here. It's underway. We can head out to the ballpark whenever we want. I live about 10 minutes away from a local stadium, and I love having the opportunity to make a last-minute decision to go head out to the ballpark and catch a game. And that's why I love using Game Time, because the prices on the Game Time app, they actually go down the closer it gets to first pitch. So with killer last-minute deals, all-in prices, views from your seat, and their lowest price guarantee, Game Time takes the guesswork out of buying tickets. And if you're somebody who's concerned about buying tickets from a third-party app and you don't have them in hand and you're worried, oh, maybe I'm going to get turned away at the door, is the ticket going to be real? One of the great things about Game Time is their ticket coverage is the most flexible customer service policy in the entire ticketing industry. Personally, I love having that peace of mind. So folks, take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Game Time. Download the Game Time app now, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONCollege for $20 off your first purchase. Folks, I got 2 tickets to a Hillsborough Hops game for $25 total. That's $5 if you use code LOCKEDONCollege after creating an account and redeeming that code at Game Time. So folks, download the Game Time app today. Last minute tickets, lowest prices, guaranteed. All right, folks, segment 2, still Andy Patton, still Locked On Zags podcast, and we're still talking Gonzaga's schedule for the upcoming season. Talked with Theo Lawson on Wednesday's episode about the WCC schedule, the fact that they don't have consecutive road games until the last 2 games in conference play. They started off on the road against Pepperdine. We talked all about that. Go check out that show if you haven't yet. But now with this update with the Arizona State game, with an update on the date for the San Diego State game, we got a pretty clear picture of the majority of Gonzaga's non-conference schedule. So we're going to go through the dates that we have right now, the games that we have on the calendar, and then take a look at what might be left on the schedule for those final 4 games. The first game in the calendar for Gonzaga this upcoming season is the aforementioned Arizona State game, November 10th. Like we said, it might end up being the first game. I don't know the exact date of when the season starts, but I think it's probably 4 or 5 days before that. If that's the case, I think they'll probably sneak one more in. Typically, their first game of the season is a home game against one of their bye game opponents in Idaho and North Florida, somebody like that. So I would expect that to come first and then the Arizona State game to be second. But last year they opened the season on November 10th against Yale, which is kind of a better opponent than they typically open against. So you never know, that could end up being the case here again. The next game known on Gonzaga's calendar is 8 days later, November 18th, and that is where we get the game against San Diego State. This is the return game. They played in the Kennel last year. They're playing at San Diego State this year, Viejas Arena. Brian Dutcher's team, they're pretty gutted from last year's roster. They lost Micah Parrish. They lost Lamont Butler. Those 2 guys transferred to Ohio State and Kentucky, respectively. Elijah Saunders transferred to Virginia. They had quite a few graduations and eligibility. They brought in some talented players in the transfer portal, but this team doesn't look on paper to be, Jaden Ledee's gone. This team doesn't look to be on paper as good as last year. And Gonzaga gets them early in the year. And again, I think this is where that continuity is going to play a role. Gonzaga's a better team than Arizona State. They're in theory a better team than San Diego State, although they're playing them on the road. So that's a little bit harder, but Gonzaga is going to be a far more well-oiled machine early in the season than they were last year, and in particular earlier than Arizona State, who lost their 6 leading scorers, and San Diego State, who I am betting probably lost their top 5 or 6 leading scorers. I don't know off the top of my head if there's anybody I'm missing, but they lost the majority of their scoring from last year. So those 2 teams are decent. I think Gonzaga is going to finish higher than both of them, but I think that they are also at an advantage because they're playing these 2 teams that are having less continuity on the roster than Gonzaga has coming into the season. Next up on the known schedule for Gonzaga is the Battle for Atlantis. That's, of course, in the Bahamas. November 27th through 29th, Gonzaga will play 3 games in Atlantis. We don't know exactly who the opponents will be. We don't know who their first matchup is going to be against, but we know the teams that are participating in the event are Arizona, Indiana, Louisville, Providence, West Virginia, Oklahoma, and Davidson. So that is 6 Power 5 teams. And then Davidson, who I know some people have already expressed, I've seen this on the Discord channel, like fear or concern that Gonzaga is going to draw Davidson. Like their non-con is going to be fine. Even if it's Davidson as opposed to being, I guess, Oklahoma or Louisville would be the other probable options for Gonzaga to draw first. It's just not that big of a deal. The difference between where Davidson's going to finish this year in Ken Pom and net and other versus where West Virginia is going to finish, where Oklahoma is going to finish. Louisville's a bit of a wild card. So is Indiana. It's kind of hard to know how those teams are going to look this year, but I don't think Davidson's going to be dramatically worse. So even if that is the first draw, it doesn't really bother me that much because their 2 other games are going to be fantastic. Obviously, everybody's hoping for the Gonzaga-Arizona Mark Few, Tommy Lloyd matchup in that championship game. That is going to be one of the most watched Gonzaga basketball games and one of the most watched college basketball games of the entire season, maybe of the entire last 5 seasons combined. That game is going to be tuned the heck into if it ends up being that matchup. After that, Gonzaga's got Kentucky at Climate Pledge Arena on December 7th. Of course, Mark Pope now leading that Kentucky Wildcats program after taking over for John Calipari, who moved to Arkansas to replace Eric Musselman, who moved to USC to replace Andy Enfield, who moved to SMU. Is a very chaotic movement of coaches there. Kevin Young comes from the Phoenix Suns to take over at BYU. But the focus is Kentucky, entirely new roster. Everybody's gone from last year's team. Mark Pope brought in a lot of talent. Lamont Butler, we mentioned him earlier. He's going to be on that Kentucky roster. Kerr Kriisa, former Arizona and West Virginia point guard. Jackson Robinson comes over from BYU. A handful of other pieces that are going to join that team. I'm very curious how they'll look at this point in the season. They'll probably have played 5 or 6 games by this point, but literally, I don't think any of these players have played together outside of preseason this year. Like they're not familiar with each other. So it's going to take some time. Very few of them have played for Mark Pope before as well. So I don't know how long it's going to take. We saw Gonzaga with not nearly as much of a roster shift last year, take about a half season to kind of find all the pieces. And I think Mark Few's a great coach. And again, he had a lot of returners. I think Mark Pope's a great coach as well, but he's got no returners. So I think it's going to take a little bit more time. I think Gonzaga's got an advantage here. And I think I've said this on the show before. I think this could be a really advantageous time of the year for this game to happen, because I think Kentucky, where they are at this point in the season in early December versus where they end up in February, will be a lot different. And so Gonzaga picking up a win here, if they do, could really help make their resume look even stronger by the time Selection Sunday rolls around. A week later, Gonzaga's got UConn. So they got Kentucky and UConn back-to-back Saturdays in December. What a time for us to be alive. That UConn game is going to be at Madison Square Garden, the mecca of basketball in New York, New York. Really fun matchup there. Of course, Gonzaga has faced Dan Hurley the last 3 times in the last 2 years. They're now going to face Bobby Hurley early in the year. Danny and UConn has taken care of Gonzaga in the NCAA tournament. They took care of them in a regular season game as well. This is going to be a nice matchup for Gonzaga to hopefully try to exact a little revenge, get a pseudo road victory over UConn and Aiden Mahaney, who is going to play for the Huskies, transferring from St. Mary's. UConn also has Liam McNeely, a star freshman coming into that program who had considered Gonzaga at one point in his high school career. So some feelings that Gonzaga could potentially get out in a victory here over Mahaney, McNeely, Hurley, and that UConn team. 4 days after the game against UConn, Gonzaga will host Nicholls State at the Kennel. That is the only bye game that we know on Gonzaga's schedule at this point. Every other game that we have that we know is either a marquee non-conference. There's a marquee non-conference game either at home or a neutral site, or of course the MTEs. Nicholls State is again your traditional bye game. It's a game Gonzaga should win. It's coming off of those 2 big games against Kentucky and UConn. It's kind of a nice tune-up heading into the Christmas break. 10 days after that game, Gonzaga will play UCLA at the Intuit Dome in LA, the new home of the Los Angeles Clippers. This will be the first college basketball game played at the Intuit Dome. Mick Cronin, Mark Few, Dominic Harris plays for UCLA. That's going to be a blast of a game. Gonzaga starts the conference season 2 days later at Pepperdine on December 30th. So that's what we know so far. 27 games, 4 more to go. What are they going to look like? Well, for starters, there's a good chance they're all at home, or at least 3 out of the 4 are at home, because right now Gonzaga's only got 2 home games on the schedule. Arizona State on November 10th, Nicholls State on December 18th. I suspect these other 4 games probably are all going to be home games for Gonzaga. And I wouldn't be surprised if they weren't all bye games, or at least 3 of the 4 are bye games. And by bye games, I mean your Idaho, your Texas Southern, like we said, Mississippi Valley State, Jackson State, Cal State Northridge, something like that. A Big West team, an SWAC team, maybe a couple SWAC teams, a local team like Idaho. I don't think they'll play Eastern Washington just because of the Dan Munson connection there, so I wouldn't expect it to be them. But Idaho, Idaho State, Montana State, North Dakota, somebody like that I think makes sense. I wouldn't be stunned if they find another big game. And if you're on the Discord channel, you know this has been rumored and tossed around in there quite a bit, that there's reports of Gonzaga trying to schedule Tennessee. I'm guessing that is getting pushed maybe to a future year, or hopefully to a future year if it's not going to happen this year. Obviously, Tennessee getting tossed onto this schedule this late in the offseason would be incredible. That'd be a really, really fun game for Mark Few and the Zags to get a chance to play. But I would be surprised if we see any team at that caliber. I would toss out Xavier. Mark Few and Sean Miller have scheduled each other a lot in the past. They've scheduled each other late in the offseason in the past. Xavier has not revealed their non-conference schedule. That is the extent of why I'm mentioning them. I don't have any inside information. I have not heard anything. I'm just saying, if there is going to be another pretty good opponent on Gonzaga's schedule, look for it to potentially be Xavier, whether it's a neutral site one-off game, whether they do set a home and home, which would be really cool to get that opportunity. They're a team to keep an eye on. The other teams that I mentioned Idaho, I mentioned Cal State Northridge. Alabama State is another team I toss out as an SWAC opponent. But again, I think if you're waiting on bated breath to find out the rest of Gonzaga's non-conference schedule, I don't want you to set yourself up for disappointment. I wouldn't be surprised if the next 4 games for Gonzaga are not opponents that really draw a lot of excitement among the fan base. Well, folks, closing out the show, talking Olympic basketball while we still can. Filip Petrusev is the only remaining Zag player who could medal at the 2024 Olympic Games. He's going to face his old coach on Thursday. We got all that and more coming up in just a second. All right, folks, segment 3, still Andy Patton, still Locked On Zags podcast. And before we move on to the Olympics, I want to say, too, if you want to listen to other Locked On shows, you want to get an update on some of these basketball programs from somebody that's not me, from somebody that is more plugged into those individual programs. I mentioned Richie Bradshaw, host of Locked On Sun Devils. Lance Daw does an awesome job with Locked On Kentucky. We got a new host, Mark Zanetto, at Locked On UConn. He's doing a great job over there. Zachary Anderson Yoxheimer is the host of Locked On UCLA. So all those shows, we got definitely some content out there for you on the Locked On Podcast Network. Check them out if you haven't yet. Of course, check out Locked On College Basketball, my sister show, if you haven't done that as well. All right, let's talk Olympic hoops. We're going to talk about Team Canada's unfortunate, devastating, heartbreaking loss and what that means for Andrew Nembhard and Kelly Olynyk. But first, I want to talk about the players still in the mix, because we had 7 Zag players go to the Olympic Games. At this point, one of them has medaled. That was Sunny Greinacher. Huge shout out again to Sunny Greinacher, gold medal for Germany in the women's 3-on-3 tournament. But outside of that, none of the other players have the opportunity to medal except for Filip Petrusev. Kelly Olynyk and Andrew Nembhard and Team Canada were eliminated. Rui Hachimura was eliminated a while ago. Yvonne Ejim for Team Canada, and then Casey Bosch, also for Team Canada on the 3-on-3 side, have all been eliminated. Connor Griffin was an assistant coach with Team Canada on the men's side, who he has been eliminated as well. So the only medaling left for Gonzaga is Mark Few or Filip Petrusev, and one of them is guaranteed to medal. And that's what we're going to find out at noon on Thursday on Peacock. USA, Serbia. It is the semifinal game. The winner of this game will play in the championship against the winner of France and Germany. Whoever wins that game wins gold. Whoever loses that game wins silver. And then, of course, between USA and Serbia, if whoever loses that game will play the loser of France and Germany. And then the winner of that game, of course, will get bronze. The loser will finish in 4th place and not get a medal. How we got here. Mark Few, Team USA, blasted Brazil. 122-87. That was the expectation, was that they were going to do that. They were 26.5-point favorites. They blew even those betting lines out of the water here. A masterclass game, really balanced scoring. Devin Booker led the Team USA with 18 points. Ant Edwards had 17-5. Joel Embiid had 14-7. Anthony Davis had 13-8, 12 points, 9 assists for LeBron. Kevin Durant had a pretty quiet night, but he became Team USA's all-time leading scorer. He passed Lisa Leslie. He has now scored the most points in Olympic basketball history for the United States. Huge shout out to Kevin Durant. I know he's not everybody's favorite player, but that is a tremendous Tremendous accomplishment for him and an incredibly well-deserved one. So Team USA advances as we thought that they would. They're going to take on the Serbians, who they already played earlier this year. Earlier this Olympics. The Serbians took down Australia 95-90 in this one. It was an overtime game. It went to overtime because of a ridiculous shot from Patty Mills, who was balling the heck out for Australia. He had a tremendous run through the Olympics here. Patty Mills had a game-winning shot over an outstretched Nikola Jokic, sent that game into overtime. The Serbians, however, outscored Australia 13-8 in overtime, picked up a 95-90 victory. Filip Petrusev was a little quiet in this one, 9 points, 5 boards, 2 steals, and an assist, 3 of 7 shooting for him. He was third on the team in minutes, and I think that highlights how important he is to this team. The only 2 players who played more minutes for Serbia in a must-win elimination game were NBA superstar and MVP Nikola Jokic, and then very, very good NBA player Bogdan Bogdanovic. Petrusev was third on the team in minutes. Again, he was their 6th leading scorer, but he made good defensive plays, got a couple of steals, like we said. He had 5 rebounds, all defensive boards. He's played pretty well. And I said this on a recent show, if you only watch Serbia play the United States, you probably have a different opinion about how Filip Petrusev has played, because he did not look good in that game. And frankly, he might not look good in this game as well. It's the big weakness for Serbia, is that they don't have the athletes to compete with Team USA really outside of Jokic. And it's not like Jokic is an elite athlete. He's just an elite basketball player. Bogdanovic is good. Jokic is good. Petrusev will need to play well for Serbia to have any chance of winning this game. The last time out, Petrusev drew the task of guarding Kevin Durant and LeBron James. If that ends up being the case again, those guys are probably going to have themselves some pretty nice games. So we'll see how this goes. Like I said, if the USA advances, which they're going to be favored pretty heavily in this game, Serbia still has an opportunity to medal. They will play either France or Germany. If they win that game, they will be bronze medalists. So we could still see Petrusev get a medal here. I hope that we do. I would like to see Team USA advance, of course. I would like to see Mark Few get a gold and Filip Petrusev get a bronze. That would be the ideal scenario. And frankly, it feels pretty likely, although somebody's going to have to beat France. And frankly, somebody's going to have to beat France. And France is kind of playing 8-on-5 the way that these last couple of games have gone. If you've been watching, I'm not one to typically complain too strongly about officiating, but it's been pretty rough. And it is clear which team is the home country in these Olympic Games. And yes, the Zag fans have a bit of a right to be extra peeved about this, because one of the most notable officiating things that has happened in this 5-on-5 men's basketball side of the tournament is that Rui Hachimura was ejected early in the 4th quarter. I think it might even been the 3rd quarter for Japan against France for a very, very soft technical foul. Rui was leading Japan in scoring. They were winning the game. He gets ejected. They called a pretty soft foul on a 3-point shooter for France. The French player hit the free throw. That tied the game, sent it to overtime. France won. It looked a little suspicious. I'm not going to say it was anything overtly bad, but it didn't look great. And then France played Canada. And that ended the medal odds for this Canadian team. It ended the Olympic run for Andrew Nembhard. It ended the Olympic run for Kelly Olynyk. Unfortunately for Kelly, potentially permanently, this may have been his last opportunity to be a part of Team Canada on a 12-man 2028 LA Olympics. Kelly might not be on that roster. This might have been it for him. I feel really bad if that's the case. He has been an icon, a staple of Canada's senior men's national team for a decade. And this was the year they were supposed to put it together. And he didn't do a lot in this game. He only played 3 minutes. He actually got benched in favor of Kem Birch, which was a little surprising and just kind of sad to see. The matchup didn't line up well with him against Victor Wembanyama and Rudy Gobert, who didn't even play that much for France. But the officiating in this game was tough. France shot 42 free throws against Canada. Canada shot 25. That's a pretty big difference. 15-point swing in terms of 17-point in terms of the number of free throws taken. France made 33, Canada made 18. So it was a 15-point swing in a 9-point game. And it wasn't entirely officiating. What happened is Canada got down early and they started to panic and they took a lot of contested threes. There was a lot of isolation basketball. They weren't driving to the hoop. Part of that is because of the presence of Victor Wembanyama or Rudy Gobert. So if you're not driving to the basket, if you're not trying to get to the free throw line, you're going to shoot less free throws. But there was still some questionable officiating. If you watch the game, you know what I'm talking about. Some calls that put some of Canada's best players on the bench early in the second half that were pretty questionable. Dylan Brooks got called for some fouls that I don't think were really there. Same with Lou Dort. And it was tough to watch. But the Canadians didn't take care of business. It's not just officiating. It never is. I said it already. Kelly only played 3 minutes in this game, 0 of 2 from the field. Andrew Nembhard played 15 minutes, but was kind of just getting cardio. And if we're being honest, 15 minutes, he had 1 assist and 2 turnovers. He didn't take any shots. He didn't get any rebounds. He didn't get any steals. He was just kind of running up and down the floor. And Canada, a lot of the criticism right now is going to Jamal Murray, who really didn't play well this entire Olympic series. There's some criticism of Coach Jordi Fernandez. There's always going to be when your team's expected to medal and you don't. But I just feel bad. I feel bad for Kelly. I don't feel as bad for Andrew because I think that this is one of potentially 3 Olympics that Andrew Nembhard could participate in. We don't know. Obviously, the timing has to work out 4 years from now if he's hurt or if he's, renegotiating a new contract or whatever. Who knows if he's going to want to play for the team in LA in 2028. The Canadians have to qualify still too, but Kelly's probably done. And it sucks for him. He's one of my favorite players. He was at Gonzaga the same 4 years that I was at Gonzaga. So seeing him be out on that stage and getting a chance to bring home a medal to the country he cares so much about was a really cool and inspiring part of the last few weeks of our coverage on Locked On Zags and just of my fandom for Gonzaga. So I feel for him. I feel a lot for him. I feel for Andrew for not, helping the team advance the way that he wanted to. I feel for Connor Griffin for being on that staff. It's hard. This team, I thought, had a chance. I felt myself rooting for Canada more than I thought that I would. I was like, well, I'm obviously rooting for Team USA, but like watching Canada get down in that game against France and keep trying to claw back, and then Evan Fournier would hit a big 3, Wembanyama would make a big play, and I was really rooting for Canada. It was a very strong feeling, and I'm sad that it didn't go their direction, but I'm hopeful for the future for the Canadian basketball, and hopeful maybe Kelly will find a way to sneak onto that roster in 2028. Going to wrap it up for me today here in the Locked On Zags podcast. We'll, of course, be back with coverage of how this game goes between USA and Serbia on Friday's show. I will, of course, keep you up to date on any recruiting updates for the Zags. Keep looking, and we got some guests lined up in the future as well. All sorts of fun stuff here on Locked On Zags as we get into the thick of the offseason. So, folks, thanks again for listening. And until next time, as always, go Zags.